The drizzle that fell on the Beacon diner was as thin and weary as the coffee Clara was pouring. It wasn't rain with purpose. It was the sky sighing, a gray exhalation that promised nothing but more gray. Each drop that beaded on the plate glass window seemed to reflect the diner's own slow fade. The neon sign outside, a proud, looping promise of the Beacon, had a flicker in its heart, the O winking in and out of existence like a failing pulse. Inside, the red vinyl of the booths was cracked, revealing the yellowed foam beneath like old wounds. The air, thick with the smell of stale grease and despair, clung to Clara's worn uniform, a pale blue dress that had seen brighter days, much like herself. Her hands, when she set the lukewarm coffee pot back on its burner, had a faint, persistent tremor, the physical manifestation of a spirit stretched too thin for too long. She was working another double shift, a 16-hour blur of wiping counters and forcing smiles that didn't reach her tired, hollowed eyes. It was a futile effort. The diner was a ghost ship, and she was its solitary, haunted captain. Taped to the inside of the kitchen's swinging door, away from the prying eyes of the few customers who still wandered in, was the foreclosure notice. The paper was stark, its black, unforgiving letters a death sentence for the only thing she had left of her husband, Mark. It gave her 1 week. Today was day 6. A family in a booth near the window, their clothes crisp and their faces radiating the easy confidence of the untroubled, flagged her down. The father, a man with a soft paunch and a hard face, gestured impatiently at his half-eaten plate of pancakes. "Is it possible to get some syrup that isn't 90% water?" he asked, his tone not of inquiry but of accusation. Clara's smile was a masterpiece of self-control, a thin, brittle shield against the world's casual cruelty. "Of course, sir. I'm so sorry about that. I'll get you a fresh bottle right away." She retrieved the new bottle, her movements practiced and smooth despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. They didn't see the foreclosure notice. They didn't see the 16-hour shifts. They didn't see the ghost of her husband in every cracked tile and faded photograph on the wall. They saw only slow service and watery syrup. When they left, the man placed a few crumpled $1 bills on the table, a tip so meager it was more insult than gesture. Clara picked them up, the paper limp and damp in her palm, and tucked them into her apron pocket. She watched their expensive sedan pull away, splashing through a puddle and spraying muddy water against the diner's front window, another stain on a dying dream. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass, the weak pulse of the dying neon throbbing against her skin, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full, crushing weight of her hopelessness. The Beacon wasn't just a diner. It was Mark's monument, and she was failing it. The world was not just ignoring her struggle. It was actively, casually, grinding it into dust. The bell above the door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that was grotesquely out of place in the funereal atmosphere. It wasn't a customer seeking refuge from the rain. It was Silas Croft, the architect of her ruin. He moved with a languid, predatory grace, his expensive suit repelling the dampness as if by sheer force of its arrogance. He didn't take a booth. He slid onto a stool at the counter, placing his leather briefcase beside him with a soft, definitive thud. He was not here to eat. He was here to feast on her failure. "Clara," he said, his voice a smooth, polished stone. "You're looking tired," he smiled, a thin, reptilian curve of his lips that didn't involve his eyes. His gaze roamed the empty diner, taking in the flickering lights and cracked vinyl with an air of triumphant ownership. "Can't say I'm surprised. This place has been running on fumes for years." Clara straightened up, her hands gripping the edge of the counter behind her back, her knuckles white. "What do you want, Silas?" He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Just checking in on my investment. The final paperwork is being drawn up as we speak." "Time's up tomorrow, sweetheart," he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the silent room. "I'm here to make you an offer." Out of the kindness of my heart, the 2 remaining customers, an elderly couple huddled in a corner booth, shifted uncomfortably. They stared intently into their coffee cups, suddenly fascinated by the dregs at the bottom. Silas's performance was for them as much as it was for her. He was establishing his domain. "I'll take all this junk off your hands," he said, waving a dismissive hand at the gleaming chrome coffee urns and the sturdy grill Mark had installed himself. The griddle, the mixers, the booths. $500. Cash. It's more than you'll get when the bank auctions it off for scrap. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up her neck. $500 for the sum of Mark's life's work. It was a calculated cruelty, designed to break what little spirit she had left. "This dump, as you call it, fed a lot of people," she said, her voice quiet but steady. It meant something. Silas laughed, a full-throated bark this time. "Meant something? Honey, it's a greasy spoon on a forgotten highway. In 6 months, it'll be the parking lot for my new commercial plaza. That will mean something. It will mean progress. It will mean money." He stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket. He looked directly at the other customers now, his voice booming with false magnanimity. "It's a sad story, but business is business. Can't let sentimentality get in the way of the future." He dropped a business card on the counter. $500. The offer's good until noon tomorrow. After that, you get nothing." He turned and walked out, the bell chiming his departure. The silence he left behind was heavier, more suffocating than before. The elderly couple avoided her eyes as they shuffled to the register, paid their bill in exact change, and scurried out into the rain, leaving Clara utterly alone with the echo of his laughter and the bitter taste of his contempt. As the door swung shut behind the departing couple, the brittle composure Clara had maintained finally shattered. She sank onto a stool, the same one Silas had just vacated, and wrapped her arms around herself as if to hold her splintering world together. The diner, once a place of bustling warmth and shared dreams, was now an echo chamber for her grief. Her gaze fell upon a faded photograph tucked into the corner of the cash register's frame. It was of her and Mark, taken the day they'd opened the Beacon. He had his arm around her, his face beaming with a pride so pure and powerful it seemed to radiate heat even through the curling, yellowed paper. Mark. He had been a mechanic, a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands but with a poet's soul. He saw beauty in worn-out engines and potential in forgotten places. This diner had been a derelict shell when he found it, but he had seen its bones, its heart. "It's a beacon, Clara," he'd said, his eyes alight with the vision. A place for people to rest. A light on the road. He had poured every dollar from his savings, every ounce of his energy, into its resurrection. He'd laid the checkered floor tiles himself, his knees aching for a week. He'd rewired the entire building, patiently tracing circuits and taming the wild electricity. He'd found the vintage neon sign in a scrapyard and spent a month painstakingly restoring it. The diner wasn't a business venture. It was a love letter written in chrome and vinyl and formica. Then came the accident. A hydraulic lift at the garage where he still worked part-time had failed. A freak occurrence, they'd said. A 1 in a million chance. It had been swift, brutal, and absolute. The man who was the vibrant center of her universe was simply gone. The medical bills that followed were a cruel postscript to the tragedy. A mountain of debt that buried her alongside her grief. That was when Silas Croft had appeared, a vulture circling a fresh kill. He'd offered her a loan, packaged as a lifeline from a concerned local businessman. The terms were predatory, the interest rates designed to be impossible to meet. She had been too numb to see the trap, signing the papers in a fog of sorrow. For 2 years she had fought. She worked from before dawn until long after dusk, fueled by coffee and a desperate promise she had whispered to Mark at his funeral. "I'll keep it safe," she'd vowed. "I'll keep your light on." But the world had changed. A new interstate had been built 5 miles to the north, diverting the lifeblood of truckers and travelers who had once kept the Beacon thriving. The town itself was shrinking. Her fight was a losing one, a battle against shifting maps and economic tides, and Silas had known it all along. She wasn't just losing a building. She was losing the last tangible piece of her husband, the final echo of his laughter, the physical manifestation of their shared dream. Each plate she washed, each cup she filled, was an act of devotion, a ritual to keep his memory alive. Silas's offer of $500 wasn't just an insult to her. It was a desecration of Mark's legacy. The following day dawned with a sky the color of a fresh bruise. A relentless, cold rain fell in sheets, drumming a frantic, anxious rhythm on the diner's flat roof. The world outside the windows was a wash of gray and brown, a landscape bled of all color and hope. The impending doom had settled over the beacon like a physical shroud. The few regulars who might have stopped in for their morning coffee were conspicuously absent. News in a small town travels faster than goodwill, and the story of Silas Croft's victory was already common knowledge. There was a shared, unspoken consensus. The beacon was already gone. Clara moved through the empty space like a phantom, her actions rote and mechanical. She wiped down counters that were already clean, refilled salt and pepper shakers that were already full, straightened chairs that no one would sit in. These small rituals were all she had left, a way to impose a sliver of order on the encroaching chaos. She was polishing the chrome base of a stool when she saw them. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a stark white van pull into the muddy parking lot. Two men in bright yellow slickers got out, carrying tripods and measuring equipment. They were Silas's surveyors. They began their work with an unhurried, deliberate insolence, driving stakes into the soft earth and stretching measuring tapes across the front of the property. It was a public and deliberate act of dominance, a declaration to the entire town that her time was over. They were measuring her for a coffin. A car slowed as it passed, the driver's face a mask of pity, before speeding up again. The silence from her neighbors was the most cutting blow. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the hardware store next door, had been one of Mark's closest friends. They had spent countless Sunday afternoons fishing together. Now, when she glanced toward his shop, she saw him quickly turn away from his front window, pretending to be busy with a display of hammers. He was a good man, but he was a scared one. Silas held sway over this town, holding mortgages and leases like a puppeteer holding strings. No one wanted to be his next target. Clara was alone, an island in a sea of silent, fearful neighbors. She felt a tremor of rage, hot and sharp, pierce through the fog of her exhaustion. Let them measure. Let them watch. She would not give Silas the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She turned her back to the window, picked up a fresh cloth, and began to meticulously clean the grill, the very grill Mark had been so proud of. She scrubbed away at imaginary specks of grease, her movements firm and defiant. If she was going down, she would go down with her head held high, in a clean diner, honoring her husband's work to the very last second. The sound of the rain and the quiet, methodical work of the surveyors outside were the only sounds in her world, a symphony of her defeat. But in her heart, a different rhythm began to beat, a stubborn, resilient pulse that refused to be silenced. The diner door creaked open, admitting a violent gust of wind that carried the raw, metallic scent of the storm. It slammed a loose shutter against the building's side with a startling crack, like a gunshot. Framed in the doorway was a figure that seemed to be composed of little more than rain and misery. An old man, bent and frail, stood shivering on the welcome mat, water dripping from the frayed hem of his thin, soaked coat and pooling around his worn-out boots. His face was a roadmap of hardship, his skin weathered and gray, his eyes downcast as if the weight of the world was too heavy to look up from. He looked less like a person and more like a stray animal that had wandered in seeking a moment's respite from the tempest. He shuffled towards the farthest booth, his movements slow and pained, and slid onto the vinyl seat. He huddled into himself, trying to occupy as little space as possible, his body racked with shivers that were deep and uncontrollable. He didn't pick up a menu. He didn't look toward the counter. He just sat, dripping and trembling, a ghost at the feast of Clara's own ruin. Every instinct in Clara's exhausted body screamed at her to ignore him. She had nothing left to give. Her charity had run dry, her well of compassion poisoned by debt and despair. She was counting the minutes until noon, the hour of her eviction. This problem was not hers to solve. But then she looked at him again. She saw past the grime, past the soaked and tattered clothes. She saw the raw, elemental human need. She saw the tremor in his hands that mirrored her own, born not of anxiety but of pure, biting cold. In that moment, watching this forgotten man shiver in the corner of her failing dream, her own monumental problems seemed to shrink. Here was a suffering she could actually do something about. A switch flipped in her soul. Defiance bloomed. If she was going to lose everything, she would lose it on her own terms. She would not be defined by Silas Croft's greed, but by her own capacity for grace. She walked into the kitchen, her steps suddenly firm and purposeful. She ignored the cheap ground beef set aside for the sparse lunch rush and pulled a thick, marbled steak from the small refrigerator, one she had been saving for a final solitary meal for herself. She fired up the grill, the hiss and sizzle a sudden, joyous sound in the oppressive silence. She whipped potatoes with real butter, ladled rich, dark gravy, and brewed a fresh, fragrant pot of coffee. She arranged it all on one of her best plates, the ones without any chips. She carried the steaming platter to the booth. The old man looked up as she approached, his eyes, a startlingly clear and intelligent blue, widening in disbelief. The aroma of the hot food washed over him, and for a moment, his shivering stilled. I can't pay for this," he rasped, his voice rough with disuse and cold. Clara placed the plate gently on the table in front of him. A genuine smile, the first she had felt in days, perhaps weeks, bloomed on her face. It felt like a muscle she had forgotten how to use. "I know," she said softly. "No one should be cold and hungry. Please, eat." She went to the back room and returned with a clean, dry towel and a thick wool jacket, Mark's favorite. She laid them on the seat beside him. "It's on the house." The old man stared at the plate, then at Clara, a complex series of emotions flickering across his weathered face. Shock, suspicion, and finally, a profound, weary gratitude. He picked up the fork, his gnarled hand surprisingly steady, and took his first bite of the steak. He chewed slowly, deliberately, as if reacquainting himself with the very concept of a hot meal. The entire act was witnessed. The two surveyors, their work momentarily forgotten, stared through the rain-lashed window, their expressions unreadable. Inside, a lone trucker named Gus, who had been nursing a coffee at the counter for the past hour, watched the entire exchange. He had known Clara and Mark for years, had seen the diner in its prime and watched its slow, painful decline. He had felt a helpless pity for her, but now, that pity was transmuting into something else entirely, respect. As the old man ate, Gus slid off his stool, walked over to the cash register, and laid a crisp $50 bill on the counter. "That's for the old fella's meal," he grunted, not meeting Clara's eyes directly, as if embarrassed by his own sudden surge of decency. "And for you. Keep the change." He gave a curt nod and walked out, his departure leaving a void filled with a new, unfamiliar warmth. The gesture seemed to break a spell. A moment later, the bell chimed again. It was Mr. Henderson from the hardware store. He stood dripping in the doorway, holding a large black umbrella, his face a portrait of shame. "Clara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw what you just did, and he faltered, looking down at his feet. "I'm sorry, Clara, for being a coward. What Silas is doing, it's a crime." He walked to the counter and ordered a coffee, his presence a silent, belated offering of solidarity. He sat in a booth near the front, a quiet sentinel against the storm outside and the one inside Clara's heart. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted. The oppressive despair had thinned, replaced by a fragile but palpable sense of dignity. Clara's simple act of kindness had been a stone tossed into a stagnant pond, and the ripples were spreading. The old man finished his entire meal, cleaning the plate with a piece of bread. He drank 2 cups of the strong, hot coffee. With each bite, with each sip, some of the frailty seemed to fall away from him, replaced by an underlying strength, a core of tempered steel. He watched Clara as she moved about the diner. His gaze no longer downcast but sharp, analytical, and intensely focused. He wasn't just seeing a kind waitress. He was seeing a warrior. When he was done, he carefully folded Mark's jacket and placed it neatly on the seat. He stood, his posture straighter now, the shivering completely gone. He walked to the counter where Clara was standing. He didn't say much. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice deeper and clearer than before. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes, she saw an ancient, unyielding code of honor. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that felt less like thanks and more like a promise. Then he turned and walked out into the rain, leaving the jacket behind. Once outside, hidden from view behind the corner of the building, he pulled a battered, old-style flip phone from his pocket. He dialed a number from memory. When the call was answered, his voice was utterly transformed. The frailty was gone, replaced by a gravelly tone of pure, undisputed authority. "Rook," he said into the phone. "It's me. I'm in Millwater. I found something here. Something worth protecting. Get the boys. All of them. Tell them we're riding to a place called the Beacon." The next morning, the sky was a cold, unforgiving slate of gray. Noon, the hour of execution. Silas Croft's polished black sedan slid into the parking lot, its tires crunching on the gravel with an air of finality. He got out, followed by a local sheriff's deputy who looked young, nervous, and profoundly uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. Silas, however, was radiating smug satisfaction. He held a clipboard with the final eviction order, brandishing it like a trophy. "Let's get this over with," Silas said to the deputy, striding towards the diner door where Clara stood waiting, her face pale but her spine ramrod straight. It was in that moment that the sound began. At first, it was just a faint, low vibration, a hum felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a distant tremor on the edge of hearing, like a far-off earthquake. The deputy paused, his hand on his holstered weapon, and tilted his head. "What is that?" Silas waved a dismissive hand. "Probably just thunder, but it wasn't thunder." The sound grew, deepening from a hum into a low, guttural rumble, then into a full-throated roar that seemed to make the very air tremble. It was the sound of 100 angry gods clearing their throats. Then they appeared. Cresting the hill on the highway, a black wave of metal and leather washed over the horizon. It wasn't a small group. It was a legion. Dozens, then scores, then hundreds of motorcycles, a rolling tide of chrome, steel, and menace. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, their engines thundering in a synchronized, terrifying chorus. At their front were the colors. The iconic Death's Head skull of the Hells Angels, a symbol recognized and feared the world over. They poured off the highway and into the diner's parking lot, the roar of their engines becoming a deafening wall of sound. They formed a perfect, menacing crescent, surrounding the diner, their headlights 100 glaring eyes fixed on Silas and the deputy. The engines did not cut out. They dropped to a low, rumbling idle, a promise of contained power, a sound that vibrated through the ground and up into the chests of everyone present. Silas Croft was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning terror. The clipboard slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the muddy ground. The young deputy's hand hovered near his gun, but he made no move to draw it, his face ashen. He was hopelessly, laughably outmatched. Doors of neighboring businesses creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. The entire town seemed to hold its collective breath, watching in a mixture of awe and fear. The bikers began to dismount, their movements economical and unified. They were a silent, disciplined army. They formed a living wall, a phalanx of leather and denim and muscle, standing between Silas Croft and the Beacon's front door. And then, from the very center of the formation, a path was cleared. The old man from the day before walked through. He was no longer bent and shivering. He stood tall, his presence radiating an authority that dwarfed everyone around him. He wore a dusty, road-worn leather cut, a Hell's Angels vest so old the patches were faded and frayed. but it was the cut itself and the primary center patch that made the older bikers stand a little straighter. It was an original, a relic from the club's genesis. He was living history. He was a founder. The old man, Rook, walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his worn boots making no sound on the wet pavement. He stopped directly in front of Silas Croft, whose bravado had completely evaporated, leaving behind a quivering, pale-faced man in an expensive suit. The air crackled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. One of the younger bikers, a mountain of a man with a long, braided beard, looked at the terrified deputy and spoke in a low, respectful tone, as if identifying a king. "That's Rook," he said, the name spoken with a reverence that bordered on religious. The name meant nothing to the deputy, but to the world these men inhabited, it was everything. It was a name whispered in legends, a name synonymous with the very creation of their brotherhood. Rook's sharp blue eyes, the same ones Clara had seen filled with gratitude, were now chips of ice. He ignored Silas for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the diner, the flickering sign, and finally settling on Clara, who stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth in stunned silence. He gave her a small, reassuring nod before turning his attention back to the developer. This establishment, Rook's voice was calm, almost conversational, yet it carried over the rumbling engines with absolute clarity, is under the protection of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Silas, summoning a final, pathetic shred of arrogance, stammered, "Protection? This is a legal foreclosure. I have the paperwork. The law is on my side. This woman is broke. You people have no right to interfere." Rook didn't even glance at the muddy clipboard on the ground. He took a step closer to Silas, invading his personal space. "The law?" Rook said, his voice dropping, becoming more dangerous, "is a funny thing. It has paragraphs and clauses. We have codes. They're simpler." He turned his head slightly, addressing the crowd of onlookers and the bikers themselves, his voice rising again. "Yesterday, I came to this town with nothing. I was cold, I was hungry, and I was invisible. I was the kind of man people step over. The kind of man people like him," he jabbed a thumb toward Silas, "would call the police on." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But this woman," he turned and pointed directly at Clara, his voice ringing with conviction. "She didn't see a bum. She saw a human being. Her world was falling apart, but she took what was probably the last good food in her kitchen and gave it to me. She asked for nothing in return. She gave me warmth. She gave me a meal. She gave me respect when I had none." He turned his icy gaze back to Silas. "That is a currency you don't understand. It's called honor. And in our world, it's the only currency that matters. This woman has more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire, worthless, money-grubbing life." As if on cue, another biker, one with a sharp suit under his leather cut, stepped forward. He was the club's lawyer. He opened a briefcase and produced a thick file. "Silas Croft," the lawyer began in a crisp, professional tone. "We conducted a preliminary investigation into your business practices overnight. We've uncovered a pattern of predatory lending, racketeering, and fraud targeting vulnerable citizens across 3 counties. We have affidavits. We have bank records. We have everything." He looked at the pale-faced deputy. "A copy of this file is on its way to the State Attorney General's office. I suggest you reconsider whose side the law is truly on, officer." Silas Croft stared at the file, then at Rook, then at the sea of grim-faced bikers surrounding him. The trap he had so carefully laid for Clara had sprung back on him with 1,000 times the force. He was the one who was caught. Rook walked past him into the diner. Clara stepped back, her mind reeling, unable to process the surreal tableau. He went directly to the counter and picked up the business card Silas had left, the one with the insulting $500 offer scrawled on the back. He tore it in half and let the pieces flutter to the floor. "We're not here to pay her debts," Rook announced, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent diner. He turned to the deputy, who was now actively trying to distance himself from Silas. "We're here to ensure justice is served." Your job here is done. Rook nodded at Silas. Is just beginning. Our lawyers will be in touch, the deputy, seeing a clear and legal exit from an impossible situation, gave a curt nod and began backing away toward his patrol car. He wanted no part of the storm that was about to break over Silas Croft. The bikers didn't lay a hand on Silas. They didn't need to. Their presence was a crushing weight. They simply stared at him, 100 judges delivering a silent verdict. Defeated and utterly humiliated, Silas stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet before scrambling into his car and speeding away. His departure a frantic, ignominious retreat. With the antagonist gone, the bikers' mission shifted. The tension did not dissipate. It transformed. It became a focused, creative energy. From sidecars and custom-built trailers attached to their bikes, they began to unload equipment. Not weapons, but tools. Power saws, sanders, welding torches, boxes of nails, cans of paint, and rolls of wiring. They were not a gang. They were a blue-collar army. A team of them, led by a man with the words Sparky stitched on his vest, immediately went to work on the flickering sign, their movements precise and expert. Another group, all burly carpenters, began examining the diner's foundation, planning reinforcements. A biker who looked as tough as old leather but moved with an artist's grace produced a set of specialized tools and began the painstaking process of reupholstering the torn vinyl on the booth where Rook had sat. Rook approached Clara, who was leaning against the counter for support, trying to absorb the tidal wave of events. He unbuttoned his own ancient vest, the sacred relic of his past. For a terrifying second, she thought he was going to give it to her. But that wasn't their way. Instead, he looked toward the door. A younger member, his face clean-shaven and earnest, walked in carrying a brand-new, pristine black leather vest. It was beautiful, the leather thick and supple, but it was completely blank. There were no patches, no colors, no name. Rook took the new vest and held it with a surprising gentleness. He didn't try to put it on her. He laid it carefully on the clean countertop. "This isn't a uniform," Rook said, his voice soft now. "It's a symbol. It means this place and the person who runs it are part of our family. You are under our protection, officially. No one," he looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of his men, "will ever disrespect you or this place again. This is a shield. Earned with honor." The community, watching from their windows and doorways, finally understood. This was not a hostile takeover. This was a restoration, a barn-raising with horsepower and a fearsome code of ethics. The week that followed was a blur of controlled, constructive chaos. Millwater had never seen anything like it. The Hells Angels worked in organized, disciplined shifts, their roaring arrivals and departures marking the beginning and end of each workday. The diner became a hive of activity, a testament to the diverse skills hidden beneath the leather and tattoos. The bikers who were electricians rewired the entire building, their work clean and up to code, banishing the flickering lights forever. The carpenters repaired the subflooring, replaced cracked window panes, and rebuilt the sagging front steps, making them solid and welcoming. A plumber, a man they called Wrench, installed a new water heater and pipes, ensuring the pressure was strong and the water was always hot. The biker who was a leatherworker, whose name was Stitch, didn't just repair the one booth. He reupholstered every single seat in the diner in a durable, deep red vinyl that gleamed under the new lights. The transformation of the physical space was mirrored by a transformation in the community. On the second day, shamed into action by the outsider's industry and inspired by Clara's stand, Mr. Henderson from the hardware store arrived with a truckload of premium paint, brushes, and rollers, a silent offering of apology and support. He spent the rest of the day painting the exterior alongside a biker whose arms were covered in intricate, colorful sleeves of ink, the two of them sharing stories and a thermos of coffee. Soon after, the local grocer appeared with crates of fresh produce, meats, and dairy. "To restock your kitchen," he said to Clara, his eyes shining with admiration. "No charge. It's the least we can do." The town's fear of the bikers had dissolved, replaced by a profound respect and a touch of awe. The men were polite, hardworking, and asked for nothing but black coffee, which Clara kept brewing in endless, fresh pots. They turned the beacon not just into what it had been, but into what Mark had always dreamed it could be. The countertops were polished to a mirror shine. The checkered floor gleamed. The kitchen was stocked and organized. The entire building felt strong, clean, and filled with a renewed sense of purpose. On the day of the grand reopening, 1 week after the bikers' arrival, the reborn diner was unveiled. The centerpiece of the restoration was the sign. The neon now glowed with a steady, brilliant, and unwavering light, a true beacon that could be seen from a mile down the highway. The name The Beacon was no longer just a name. It was a statement. The diner was packed. Every booth, every stool was filled. And it wasn't just with bikers. The entire town was there. The mayor, the sheriff, Mr. Henderson, the grocer, the once pitying families. They all came to pay their respects, to spend their money, and to be a part of the new chapter. Silas Croft was a ghost, his name now spoken only in whispers. The legal and financial storm the club's lawyers had unleashed had dismantled his predatory empire with brutal efficiency. He had lost everything. Behind the counter, Clara moved with a newfound energy. She wore a crisp white apron over her simple dress, her hair tied back, her eyes bright and clear. She was no longer a victim waiting for the end. She was the proud proprietor of the finest diner in the county. And hanging on the wall behind her, in a place of honor right next to the faded photograph of her and Mark, was the blank leather vest. It was a silent, powerful guardian, a testament to an honor code she had unknowingly fulfilled and a promise of protection that would never be broken. The sun began its slow descent, painting the bruised evening sky in strokes of orange and purple. Inside the beacon, the warm light and happy chatter created a bubble of sanctuary against the encroaching twilight. The clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter were the sounds of a community reborn. Clara, refilling a customer's coffee cup, felt a sense of peace settle over her. So profound and complete it felt like a foreign country. The exhaustion that had been her constant companion for 2 years had been replaced by a deep, satisfying tiredness that came from purposeful work, not from despair. Her smile was no longer a shield. It was a genuine expression of a joy she thought she had lost forever. Rook sat in the same booth where he had shivered just a week before. The booth's vinyl was now a rich, unblemished red. He wasn't eating a steak. He was just sipping a black coffee, watching the scene unfold with a quiet, paternal satisfaction. He had not come for a reward. He had come to balance the scales. He had seen a flicker of honor in the darkness and had brought the full force of his world to ensure that light would not be extinguished. As Clara moved back behind the counter, her eyes met his across the crowded room. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that shared glance, there was a universe of understanding. It was a look of mutual respect between two sovereigns of different, but equally honorable kingdoms. A quiet acknowledgement that a debt of dignity, once paid, is never forgotten. Outside, a low rumble began, a familiar and now comforting sound. It was time. The bikers who had been eating began to file out, leaving generous tips on their tables. They moved with the same quiet efficiency they had shown all week. They were builders, and their work here was done. Clara stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched them mount their iron horses. The entire town seemed to spill out of the diner and the surrounding shops to witness the departure. Mr. Henderson stood beside Clara, his arm protectively around his wife's shoulder. The young deputy was there too, off-duty, leaning against his car with a look of quiet admiration. Rook was the last to mount his bike. He swung a leg over the machine, its chrome gleaming under the diner's brilliant new sign. He put on his helmet and looked one last time at Clara, and at the diner. He gave a final, definitive nod. Then he turned, and with a twist of his wrist, the engine of his legendary motorcycle exploded into a deafening roar. It was the signal. In perfect unison, hundreds of engines answered his call. A thunderous chorus that rolled across the small town and out into the vast, open plains. They pulled out of the parking lot, not as a menacing wave, but as a proud, disciplined procession. They were knights returning from a successful campaign. They rode off down the highway, their taillights a string of red jewels receding into the darkness until the thunder faded back into a distant rumble, and then into silence. They left behind a restored business, a healed community, and a woman who now stood as a pillar of the town she had once felt so alone in. The last image, as the townspeople slowly began to disperse, was of the diner's sign, the beacon, glowing with a steady, unwavering warmth against the deep velvet of the night sky. And inside, hanging on the wall, the silent, powerful promise of the leather vest, a symbol that honor, once recognized, is protected forever.